this is their introduction to cells, and as I get my pen here, we can find this in chapter 7. And we're really going to do two things in this video. One, we're going to talk about the cell theory, and we're going to talk about the difference between pro and eukaryotic cells. All right. So what we need to remember is that if something is going to be living, one of the basic things about biology is that it's made up of cells. So it is going to be the smallest functional part of biology that is alive. It's the smallest unit of any living thing is going to be a cell. In fact, many things are single cellular, but they are living. And so if we think about the cell theory and what it actually tells us, we have three basic postulates that were made by several scientists. The first is that all living things are made up of cells. The second is that cells are going to be the basic unit of structure and function, and that all cells are produced from existing cells. We cannot just spontaneously make a cell. All right, so how did this come to happen? The first person to see a cell after microscopes were made in the mid-1600s was an Englishman named Robert Hooke. He used a microscope to look at a non-living piece of plant material called cork. And in the cork, he saw these thousands of tiny little empty room-like structures, and he called them cells because they looked like rooms. And that's how we came to use the term cell in biology. Okay, now we now know that living cells are not just empty chambers, but they have a lot of working parts and they have a lot of different functions. Okay, so our first scientist that helped us with the cell theory was a man from Holland named Anton van Leeuwenhoek. Van Leeuwenhoek. And he was looking at some pond water underneath a microscope. Okay, and what he saw were these little organisms that were moving around. And so he was the first to see living cells. First to see living cells. All right, and that was the bacteria in the pond water. So he wrote this paper and sent along these pictures that we see over here in Figure 3. He sent this picture to this big science company called the Royal Society. This was back in the late 1600s. 200 years later, another scientist from Germany named Matthias Schleiden was looking at plants underneath a microscope. He was taking little pieces of plants and looking at them underneath the microscope, and he observed that all the plants that he looked at, the thousands of plants that he looked at, were all made of cells. So he said, okay, not only do we have living things made of cells, but plants must be living because they are made of cells. Later that same year, Theodor Schwann, also from Germany, was looking at animals. And he discovered that all animals were made of cells. All right, so when we put those two things together, along with what Robert Hooke and Van Leeuwenhoek put together, we see the first two postulates come together. One, that we have all living things made of cells, and that the cells are going to be the basic unit of structure and function. In 1855, a scientist named Rudolf Virchow concluded that all cells were going to divide and be produced by existing cells. All right, so that gives us the third postulate in our cell theory, that all cells come from existing cells. So if we look at our three postulates again, the fundamental concept of biology is that all things are made up of all living things are made up of cells. All cells are the basic units of structure and function, and new cells are produced from existing cells. Since that time, since the late 1800s, we've added a few things. The fourth kind of newer postulate is that all cells use energy. So energy is going to flow within the cells. All cells need and use energy to do whatever they're doing at that time. Second thing is that hereditary information, otherwise known as DNA, is going to be passed from an old cell to a new cell. And the final thing that we've added to the cell theory is that all cells have the same basic chemical structure or chemical components. And what I mean by that is all cells are going to have carbohydrates, all of them are going to have lipids, all of them are going to have proteins, and all of them are going to have nucleic acids, okay, or DNA or RNA. All cells are going to have those things. Next, let's talk a little bit about the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. I mentioned this in class that pro means before. Karyote, when we're talking about cells, refers to the nucleus. So prokaryotes means before a nucleus. So these are going to have no nucleus. No nucleus. EU means true. And again, karyotes means nucleus. So what this means is these cells are going to have a real nucleus. They're going to have a membrane-bound nucleus. All right. A nucleus is just a large structure that contains the cell's genetic material. You can basically think of the nucleus as the brain of the cell, or the epicenter of the cell. It's going to control many of the cell's activities. All right, so eukaryotes are those cells that enclose their DNA in a nucleus. Prokaryotes do not, and we can see that in the picture here. In the prokaryotic cell, we have our DNA here, but there's no membrane around the DNA. In the animal and the plant cell, we have this nucleus, and in the middle of this nucleus, we're going to have many times a nucleolus, and in here is our DNA. Same with the plant cell. Okay. The other thing that you'll notice is there isn't a whole lot in this prokaryotic cell over here. In eukaryotes, we have several other membrane-bound organelles. We've got the endoplasmic reticulum, we've got mitochondria, we've got ribosomes, we've got the Golgi apparatus, we've got several different things. In the plant cell, we have the endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi, chloroplast, the vacuole. So eukaryotic cells are much more complex. All right, so prokaryotic cells are going to be smaller and generally simpler than eukaryotic cells. All right, but even though they're simple, they still grow, they still reproduce, they still respond to the environment. All things that we need to have in order to be considered alive. And many of them even move. All right, so for instance, this one has a little flagella here, all right, that will work as a tail to move it. Prokaryotes generally have circular DNA as well. Circular DNA. Okay, and we can't tell that this is circular right now because it's all balled up. But generally, prokaryotes have circular DNA. DNA is not covered in histones, so this DNA also has no histones. okay, which is why it's able to be circular. The ribosomes, prokaryotes will have ribosomes, but the ribosomes are extremely simple. Ribosomes are small and simple. All right, and other than the ribosomes, there are no organelles. If we take a look at our eukaryotes, eukaryotes are generally larger and more complex, all right, and they're going to contain dozens of different structures called organelles. All right, and eukaryotic cells are going to be highly specialized. That means that different cells have different jobs. Different cells have different jobs. All right. So eukaryotes are going to be plants, animals, fungus, organisms commonly called protists are all going to be eukaryotic. Eukaryotic cells are also going to have linear DNA instead of circular, linear meaning a line. So linear DNA, and usually that DNA is going to have histones, and what this allows it to do is kind of wind up into chromosomes. This allows the DNA to become chromosomes. Okay. Ribosomes are going to be larger and more complex, so ribosomes are large and complex. And the cytoplasm contains many organelles. Many organelles. So there's the beginning to our cell unit. Hopefully you guys will get yourselves into the book to find out a little bit more about the different organelles and what they do within the cell. And it's going to continue through biology into our next units when we talk about how the cell divides, making energy within the cell, making proteins, and so on and so forth. So this is a very important part of the class here to understand. Make sure that you understand the difference between prokaryotes, eukaryotes, what organelles are and what they do, and then also that life is cellular, and that means that we have the cell theory and that all things are made up of cells, that there are a basic unit of structure and function, and finally that cells are going to come from other cells. All right? Have a good evening, and we will see you in class.